My name is Esteban Del Rio. I'm a professor here at the Department of Communication. I'm also the director of the Francis G. Harp Center for Catholic Thought and Culture. The Harp Center endeavors to animate Catholic thought and culture broadly, inclusively, with across the disciplines and ways of thinking and ways of knowing. And we're really excited tonight to have you, or this afternoon anyway, to have you all here. This is a Switgall Lecture, and this lecture series was made possible. It's annual. It's made possible thanks to the generous donation by a friend of the University of San Diego, Amelia Switgall, who was born in Czechoslovakia and educated by the religious of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, who founded the University of San Diego. She grew up in Budapest, Hungary, and she fled communism during World War II and has become a generous philanthropist, or had become a generous philanthropist for Catholic causes. Broadly, the Switgall Lecture creates an opportunity for our community here to engage in ideas related to Catholic theology and the larger world. In the past, the Switgall Lecture has been delivered by thinkers, writers, and teachers, including Houseman Ospino of Boston College, Brian Messingale of Fordham University, and Emily Reimer Berry, our own from the University of San Diego, here in the front row. Professor Eggemeier, like the others in this series, brings an interest in how Catholic thought helps to both confront and heal a hurting world. Matthew Eggemeier is professor of religious studies at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, a wonderful place, where he teaches on political and liberation theologies, contemporary Christian theologies, and postmodern theologies, and recently completed a cycle as class dean for the class of 2023. Just finished that. So a terrific thing they do at Holy Cross, where there's a faculty member who moves along with the class across their 4 years, and great work. His books include Against Empire, Ecclesial Resistance in the Form of Radical Democracy, and with Peter Fritz and Lazarus, Catholicism and the Crises of Neoliberalism, and more and more and more. But for me, speaking for myself, a catalyst for inviting Professor Eggemeier to USD is to mark 10 years since the publication of his book, A Sacramental-Prophetic Vision, Christian Spirituality in a Suffering World. In those 10 years, from 2014, when the book first came out, till now, Matt has engaged with faculty at Catholic colleges and universities across North America through his participation in the Collegium Colloquy, an annual summer experience where faculty from Catholic colleges and universities across North America explore the intersection of their intellectual and inner lives in the context of working at Catholic universities. I have seen Matt time and again at these really unique experiences in higher ed broadly, speak with both clarity and a forcefulness, power about the need for justice and the persistence of beauty and hope to create a better world. Matt's work broadly has helped to teach me that hope is generative and that it shall not be eclipsed by the truth of injustices that a prophetic imagination must call out, and that we see over and over and over again in our world and our news, and that gets so much of our attention. But hope instead is generative in contesting cynicism and resignation, and can become the spark that reaches out beyond the surrounding emptiness, to paraphrase Anson Rybnak. Hope is very important to me, and I feel that it is important for the university, for the community, and for our collective endeavors. And I think that a lot of what I've gotten from Matt's work really kind of centers hope. Please join me in welcoming Matt Eggemeier here to the University of San Diego.
Thank you so much, Esteban, for that warm and generous introduction. I think all of you know that Esteban is kind of a thought leader in Catholic higher education circles, so it was a great honor for me to receive an invitation to come out here and give this lecture. It's also great to see former formative mentors, Mary Doak, and friends, Victor Carmona. Victor and I endured many South Bend winters together at the University of Notre Dame, and he came out on top, landing at San Diego, and me in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I still endure them to this day. So the research that I'm presenting today, can everyone hear me? The research that I'm presenting today emerges in part out of my experience in the classroom this semester. I'm teaching a course titled War, Prisons, and Theology. In this class, as in every class I teach, I'm trying to introduce my sometimes very skeptical students about Catholicism, introduce them to the countercultural productivity of Catholicism at times. Sometimes it's productively countercultural, sometimes it's non-productively countercultural. In this lecture, I want to focus on how it might be productive. And I want to do that by exploring a prophetic mode of theologizing. This is what I do with my students, in which we, in the class over the course of the semester, examine various theologians, and we describe them as cultural physicians who diagnose some of the pathologies that ail us at a societal level, and who also point toward possible remedies that can return us to some measure of social health. If this works. So as will be evident in my remarks today, I'm really influenced in this research project and this teaching by two prophetic theologians, two prophetic thinkers. One of them is Martin Luther King Jr., and the other one is Pope Francis. And my argument in every class I teach basically is that the prophetic method or prophetic forms of theologizing usually follow broadly three steps. First, there's a critique of the dominant social order, insofar as that social order produces unjust and unnecessary suffering, which is every social order, right? Secondly, you try to describe an alternative to that social order, where we could go if we were to build a more just and inclusive and peaceful social order. And then third and finally, you try to provide your audience with a set of practices or strategies for realizing that alternative. So if we think about Martin Luther King Jr., particularly in the late 1950s and early 1960s, his critique obviously is of the Jim Crow racist order, right? The alternative that he gives is on August 28th, 1963, he delivers the I Have a Dream speech, right? He also talks in various ways as a Baptist minister. He talks about Jesus's preferred kind of utopian symbol for an alternative, the kingdom of God or the reign of God. But also as an American citizen, he talks frequently about the unrealized promise of democracy, right? And then third and finally, in terms of practices, he clearly gave speeches, he organized, but his method really was nonviolent resistance. And so my argument this afternoon will unfold in three sections and will follow this basic prophetic framework. First, I will argue that the United States, since its inception, has been involved in a series of inner and outer wars, which are legitimized and authorized by invoking the need to constrain or eliminate internal and external threats. Importantly, these threats are frequently constructed as racialized threats. And so it's critical as we work through this material that we attend to the relationship between war making and race making. Second, I want to explore how we might imagine different ways of resolving social conflict. I mean, because that's what wars do. They resolve social conflict violently. So I want to explore different ways of resolving social conflict by examining Pope Francis's dramatic call for the abolition of war, and link this to some just peace principles for building a more just and peaceful society. Third, I will briefly reflect on how we might apply this Catholic abolitionist horizon to a prominent front on America's inner war, which is mass incarceration. The cultural theorist and philosopher in Frames of War, Judith Butler, makes the following observation about war and its logic, and I quote, "One way of posing the question of who we are in these times of war is by asking whose lives are considered valuable, whose lives are mourned, and whose lives are considered ungrievable. We can see the division of the globe into grievable and ungrievable lives from the perspective of those who wage war in order to defend the lives of certain communities and to defend them against the lives of others, even if it means taking those latter lives. So when we examine war within this frame as a defense of lives that matter, often by taking lives that do not matter as much or do not matter at all, we can view United States domestic and foreign policy as involved in a series of inner and outer wars. These wars view some lives as valuable and worthy of protection, and other lives as punishable and ultimately expendable. I think we can get a better sense of how to concretize this frame within an American context by turning to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, A Time to Break the Silence, which was delivered on April 4th, 1967. So famously, what King was doing in this speech was he was breaking his silence about the Vietnam War. And he came out ferociously against the Vietnam War in this speech. And so that's a picture of him at the Riverside Church giving this speech. But in this speech, he also offered a broader diagnostic challenge to American society. He observed that the United States is shaped by three social evils: racism, poverty or inequality, and militarism. And he argued that these three social evils index which lives matter and which lives do not matter in America. King suggests that in terms of US domestic and foreign policy, people of color, the poor, and non-Americans matter less than white people, affluent people, and American citizens. And further, US policy, both domestically and internationally, is engineered, at least in part, to exploit, expel, and sacrifice the former in order to protect and secure privileges for the latter. So King is throwing down in this speech in a really disruptive way. And so he is assassinated 1 year to the day after he gives this speech, April 4th, 1968. His disapproval rating at that point was 55% among the African-American community and 72% among the white community, right? Disapproval. I mean, I suspect if we took a poll now, it would be a 90% approval. But part of the reason for that 90% is that we're hiding some of this kind of explosive prophetic critique that King ultimately offered. In this speech, King also maintains that these three social evils are interrelated. So for him, poverty and war are interrelated because he, as he puts it, we spend $35 billion a year to fight a war in Vietnam, but reject legislation in Congress to allocate $44 million to get rid of rats in slums and ghettos in our country. Elsewhere in another speech, he talks about the fact that Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society program, like a New Deal, it was going to be enacting a war on poverty, and it's going to be an attempt to build a more egalitarian social order. He says the Great Society was shot down on the battlefields in Vietnam, right? The issue that King is pointing toward here concerns resource allocation. We have limited resources as a country, and how these resources are spent is an expression of the social health or unhealth of our society. I mean, if we think about this in today's terms, things haven't changed at all, actually. So the fiscal year 2023, the United States military and defense budget was $877 billion. That's a huge number, but what does it actually mean? When you contextualize it in terms of what other countries are spending, it becomes, frankly, quite scandalous. So we spend as much annually as the next 10 countries combined, right? So we're just over 4% of the global population, the United States of America, but we spend 40% of global spending on military and defense. Another prominent feature of America's inner and outer wars that King focuses on is the role that race plays in these wars. It's well known what he thinks about domestic policy with respect to race, but he also reflected on the relationship between race and American foreign policy. And he argued that the Vietnam War is, and I quote, a result of racist decision-making. Men of the white West have grown up in a racist culture, and their thinking is colored by that fact. They don't really respect anyone who is not white. I don't believe we can have world peace until America has an integrated foreign policy. end of quote. I mean, so what King's doing here in a brilliant kind of move is effectively saying that if you think that we had a racist domestic policy in the 1950s and 1960s, and that didn't spill over into our foreign policy, you're doing some genuinely impressive mental gymnastics, right? They're fundamentally and inescapably interrelated. A civil rights activist and contemporary of King's, Jack Odell, who's pictured there, forcefully made this point in a slightly different way in 1965 when he drew the lines that connect Selma, Alabama to Saigon, Vietnam, or what is currently Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. He observed that on the very same day that American forces put boots on the ground in Vietnam, this was in early March 1965, African Americans and other civil rights activists were brutally beaten by the police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge as they marched from Selma to Montgomery in order to defend their voting rights. It's a provocative image that he's painting. Boots on the ground in Saigon and boots on the ground for American police in Selma. So Odell concludes that the United States was able to, and I quote, arrogantly violate the right of the Vietnamese people to settle their disputes because the United States had for 90 years denied the African American community in the Jim Crow South the right to choose the kind of government they wish to live under by guaranteeing the right to vote and participate in democracy. He concludes this is the link that connects Selma and Saigon. As an aside, I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes in this lecture, but as an aside, I mean, so this is one way of thinking about interwar and outer war, what King and Odell are developing here in terms of civil rights and anti-Black racism in the Vietnam War. I think we could move geographically and chronologically around the world and make similar cases. So if we turn to Latin America, for instance, there's a famous quote from Henry Kissinger in 1972 when he's commenting on Chilean elections in the South American country, Chile. He says, the issues at stake are too important to allow the Chilean voters to decide for themselves. So many of us know what followed this in the Nixon administration. On September 11th, this is the other September 11th that we never talk about, 1973, we helped to orchestrate and enact a coup that overthrew the democratically elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende. This threw the country into a military dictatorship for many years, right? And destabilized the country. I mean, Odell is saying exactly this. We deem certain people worthy of self-rule and self-determination and democracy, and others we don't. And we meddle in their affairs when we don't. So if we went to, for instance, Guatemala, the same exact thing happened in 1954. Jacobo Arbenz was democratically elected. We ousted him in part because we were doing the bidding of the United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita. They were calling for radical land reform in the region, and that would have taken land from this big US corporation. Again, we know what happens next. We're thrown into a 30-year civil war in Guatemala in which over 200,000 human beings died. El Salvador, we sided with some of the biggest creeps in the Western Hemisphere in the Salvadorian Civil War. So we can go through a bunch of different countries and narrate this history. That's the outer war. What I'd want to argue is that we have destabilized Central America, for instance, with countless interventions and coups. And when you destabilize countries, it results in economic deprivation, chaos, and violence. And so what happens? People understandably flee that. And when they flee that, where do they go? Many people have come northward to the United States of America. What happens when they get there? We criminalize them and we exploit their suffering for political gain oftentimes, right? So in the 2024 election, I think the border is going to be a fundamental issue. Trump is already saying quite a bit on that front about the border as a war zone. That's an example of the inner and outer war as well. I want to move to one more historical period before moving on to the theological section of this lecture. I think we can see a different manifestation of inner wars and outer wars with the war on crime announced by Nixon in the 1970s and the war on terror announced by George W. Bush in 2001. To use Odell's language, the link between the war on crime and the war on terror is the use of overwhelming state violence to manage and to eliminate, in certain cases, internal and external threats. In my remaining remarks in this section, I want to focus on the war on crime, but I do want to say about the war on terror, this is a clear example for me of us using overwhelming force to eliminate threats. So we know that on September 11th, 2001, we lost 2,977 lives on that day, right? Our response was to engage in a 20-year war on terror in which we spent $8 trillion. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, right down the street from Brown University, and they have this wonderful program at the Watson Institute called the Cost of War, which calculates the financial cost of war, but also the lives lost. And they estimate that the war on terror, the 20-year campaign in the Middle East, killed 4.5 million human beings. So 900,000 through direct warfare and conflict, and then 3.6 million through collateral damage, right? Just a disproportionate response to the really tragic situation that we suffered on September 11, 2001. But if we turn back to the domestic scene, in the early 1970s, Richard Nixon announced a war on crime and argued that if there is one area where war is appropriate, it is in the war on crime. He said, we need a total war against the evils that we see in our cities, and that we must wage a total war against public enemy number one, the problem of dangerous drugs. Importantly, this domestic war, this inner war, represents a clear example of the link that exists between war making and race making in America. The war on crime announced by Nixon and continued in various ways by Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and others was part of a political strategy, the so-called Southern strategy, that used coded forms of racism to mobilize white voters who were resentful about civil rights progress. Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton employed this strategy successfully by campaigning on getting tough on crime, specifically urban crime, heavily policing certain types of drugs, and enacting massive cuts to welfare programs. After achieving electoral success with dog whistle political strategies, these politicians then delivered on their campaign promises. They passed legislation that dramatically expanded funding for policing and prisons, which then swept unprecedented numbers of Americans into the prison system. The war on crime ushered in what we describe or what we refer to as an era of mass incarceration, in which the prison population went from around 400,000 in the late 1970s. It peaked in 2008 at 2.3 million, and now we're hovering around 1.8 million. The astonishing thing, though, is that when you look at like the United States vis-a-vis certain European countries from 1900 to 1975, we had basically the same per capita incarceration rate. It was like 100 out of 100,000. And then all of a sudden, during this war on crime, what you find is us escalating things quickly, and actually they go down. So we end up at like 550 out of every 100,000. And most European countries that we were comparing ourselves to hover around 80 out of 100,000. So something funky is going on here, right, during this period in American history. And as we can see from this slide, the policies have disproportionately impacted the African-American community, which is frankly unsurprising when we look at the origins of the project of mass incarceration, which was a backlash against civil rights. And I would actually argue that it's complicated. It's certainly the Southern strategy sweeps a tremendous amount of Americans into the jail system. But I think it's really a result of a kind of toxic mix between the Southern strategy and what we technically call in academia neoliberal modes of governance that emerged during this period. And so the neoliberal theory of the state, and Reagan's really kind of the great promoter of it, says there's two functions to the state. The first function of the state is to privatize public goods. What are public goods? Public goods are food, water, utilities, education, health care, things of this sort. So what neoliberals want to do is they want to privatize those and deliver those over to the market. So if you have enough money, you can purchase healthcare, but it's not going to be provided by the government. So this is part of a strategy to reduce spending in order to cut taxes. So that's one function of the state. The other function of the state is security. Privatization and security. So the one public good that remains is security. And that's international security in terms of military spending. That's also domestic security in terms of policing and prisons. And so what we find is we're cutting welfare and we're expanding funding on policing and prisons. Toxic mix. And what we end up doing is managing poverty by criminalizing it. And so we sweep tremendous numbers of people into the criminal justice system. So I want to move to the next section now and turn to contemporary Catholic social teaching on war to begin to articulate a response to America's inner and outer wars. Since the 1960s, official Catholic social teaching, I think, has taken a rather radical stance on war. The rallying cry of successive popes has been that war should be outlawed, that we should never support war again, and that we should find alternative ways to resolve social conflict. Pope Francis made this feature of Catholic social teaching abundantly clear in 2016 when he observed that, and I quote, and that's the third quote up there, "The basic premise is the ultimate and most deeply worthy goal of human beings and of the human community is the abolition of war," end of quote. With this statement and many others, he says stuff like this quite frequently. Francis formalized the teaching of his predecessors and set the abolition of war as the horizon for Catholic social teaching. So if abolition is the horizon, what is the practice that he proposes that would move us closer to this maybe impossible end? You know, if we're thinking about the prophetic method, we have a critique of the inner and outer wars. We have the alternative, which is the abolition or the elimination of war. How do we get from A to B? Traditionally, Catholic social teaching on war has been framed by a pacifism, just war binary. Pacifism, of course, argues that the use of violence is never permissible under any circumstance. Just theory maintains that under rare circumstances, violence can be used basically for the purpose of self-defense or for humanitarian intervention. And so these have really been the two options that have been fairly dominant in Catholic history. From Jesus' death to the 4th century, the church's normative position was pacifism. After Constantine converts in the early 4th century and Christians start having access to state power, we get the generation of the just war theory with St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, and others. Now, one might think that because Pope Francis's stated aim is the abolition of war, that pacifism would be the option he endorses. If you want to stop war, making nonviolence normative would be a straightforward way to do so. But this is not the case. Francis continues to maintain, and has done so repeatedly, that governments have a legitimate right to defense once every means of peaceful settlement have been exhausted. By continuing to affirm the use of violence, at least as a very, very, very last resort, Francis is sidelining pacifism, at least as the normative position of official Catholic teaching. Are we then left with just war theory as the alternative, which provides criteria for discerning when the use of force and/or violence is appropriate? I would argue this is not the case either. No pope since the 1960s has endorsed any war as fulfilling just war criteria. Francis has been particularly critical in assessing the viability of just war theory as an appropriate approach in the contemporary world. He has argued that Augustine forged a concept of just war that we no longer uphold in our own day. Wars are always unjust, and it is very difficult to even speak of the possibility of a just war today. There is no such thing as a just war. They do not exist. And so Francis appears to be moving beyond the pacifism, just war binary that has set the stage for Catholic social teaching for a very long time. But he doesn't want to entirely eliminate either pacifism or just war as an option. They still remain tools in the tool belt in some sense. And so I want to argue that he is foregrounding just peace approaches as the most effective means of moving us toward the horizon of abolition. I mean, there's no explicit place in which Pope Francis says this, but I think a lot of Catholic social teaching on war from the 1960s forward is kind of circulating around what we call just peace ideas without naming it as such. So what is just peace? I think one of the most basic ways to think about just peace is to draw the distinction between negative peace and positive peace. This is a distinction that emerged in peace studies in the early 1960s. Johann Galtung, the father of peace studies, made this distinction. And then some of you might know in the letter from the Birmingham jail, quite separately, Martin Luther King Jr. drew the exact same distinction. So negative peace defines peace as the absence of conflict. If there's not fighting in the streets, if there's not open warfare, we have realized negative peace in society. The problem that Galtung and King point towards with this definition of peace is that it can tolerate enormous amounts of structural injustice. Effectively, if there is stability and order at the surface, peace has been achieved. By way of contrast, just peace is oriented by a positive sense of peace and defines peace as the presence of justice in the social order. Catholic just peace approaches are rooted in the view that, as Paul VI puts it, if you want peace, work for justice. Or as Pope Francis earlier this month stated, without justice, there is no peace, and where justice is not respected, conflicts arise. In terms of like a Catholic just peace approach, I actually think in 2002, John Paul II put forward the categories that are usually generally operative when he said, no peace without justice, no justice without forgiveness. And so I just want to tick through these 3 points, and I'm going to focus on the middle one because in the next section of my talk, I'm going to focus a bit more on the first and third. So the first one is, I mean, when you talk about justice, this is really preventative measures, right? You're trying to build a social order in which you're eradicating forms of injustice that ultimately lead to conflict. So I do think Paul VI, if you want peace, work for justice, is a really nice, succinct summary of what's going on here. If we think about this, there's analogs. I mean, Black Lives Matter had a number of rallying cries, but one of them was no justice, no peace. Similar things are going on here. In terms of the third, forgiveness, this is oftentimes spoken about in terms of reconciliation or restorative justice. And this is thinking about how you build peace after conflict has occurred. How do you restore the health of both parties, the aggressor and the victim, right? And so there's a lot of theories about restorative justice that are circulating in Catholic social teaching that respond to this particular point. The second point in between peace, nonviolent conflict resolution, I just want to say a bit more about. I think Catholic social teaching finds nonviolent ways to resolve conflict as a fundamentally existential issue. We know that, for instance, Martin Luther King Jr. said, the decision is not between nonviolence and violence, it's between nonviolence and non-existence, right? Pope Francis recently proclaimed that the moment has come to abolish war, to erase it from history before it erases us from history. Similar logic's being deployed here, that this is existential for us. As I noted at the beginning, I've been teaching this course, War, Prisons, and Theology, this semester at Holy Cross. And I learned so much. If there's students in the audience, professors learn so much from you. And I thought I was really savvy in constructing the syllabus. I put a bunch of the greatest hits of nonviolent resistance at the front of the syllabus. So we read Gandhi, we read Martin Luther King Jr., we read Dorothy Day, we read others. And the response that I got from my students was, this is interesting, but I don't think it's effective. So it's morally compelling and maybe theologically compelling, but come on, it's not effective. A week ago, we actually encountered some social scientists. So for theologians in the audience, bring social scientists in. They can be really effective in making the case that you can't make on your own. And the social scientists we brought in were Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, who've done a load of research about the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance. So in 2011, they jointly published a book, and then Erica Chenoweth published a book in 2020. And what they did is they went through, Chenoweth went through 600 case studies of the use of violent resistance and nonviolent resistance to achieve social change. And what she found is that 35% of the time, nonviolent resistance is effective. 10% of the time, violent resistance is effective. This isn't ousting dictators. This isn't achieving human rights and civil rights, all sorts of things. And the key to this finding for Chenoweth is that you get more participation in a population out of nonviolent resistance than you do out of violent resistance. If you ask people to take up arms with you, many people will decline. If you ask for people to march in the streets with you, many people will participate. And so she thinks the trigger point is around 3.5% of the population in any particular state or nation. If you get that number out in the streets, you have an enormously good chance at success. My students said, Professor Eggemeier, why were you hiding this from us? This is enormously convincing. And they really pressed me. They said, we need to get this message out there. This is really important that there's actually data that says this is a more effective means of resolving conflict and violence. And Chenoweth also points to the fact that when you look at stability post-resistance, the violent resistance campaigns have about a 5% chance of having some durable, democratic, stable government, whereas nonviolent resistance has 60%, right? So in terms of peace and sustainability, oftentimes nonviolence is going to be a more effective method ultimately. I now want to finally move to the last section of my talk. I think that one of the most interesting features of the just peace approach for resolving social conflict is that it can be applied to international as well as domestic conflict. So theologians who have worked in this area have focused almost exclusively on international matters. And so I want to try and examine the implications of what we have discussed here in terms of America's inner and outer war and point toward a domestic issue, which is mass incarceration. In essence, if I put my cards on the table, what I'm trying to do is nudge US Catholic social teaching in a more radical direction. Overall, I find that official Catholic social teaching in the United States has been rather anemic on criminal justice issues. But I think if we take seriously Pope Francis's recent reflections on abolition and the just peace framework that we've been describing here and apply it to the domestic context, we can begin to arrive at what I take to be, and what I said earlier, are some productively countercultural conclusions. In order to make this argument, I'm going to attempt the impossible. I want to place the reflections of the American prison abolitionist Angela Davis alongside Pope Francis and point to their convergence on how to respond to mass incarceration. Francis never comments explicitly on American mass incarceration, but he does say things generally about war and about prisons. And so that's what I'm going to be focused on. Angela Davis has long advocated for the elimination of prisons and has been at the forefront of the abolitionist movement in the United States. In 2003, she published a book that some of you might be familiar with, which is titled Are Prisons Obsolete?, in which she makes the following argument, and I quote about abolition. We need to envision a continuum of alternatives to imprisonment, demilitarization of schools, revitalization of education at all levels, a health system that provides free physical and mental care to all, and a justice system based on reparation and reconciliation rather than retribution and vengeance. The creation of new institutions that lay claim to the space now occupied by the prison can eventually start to crowd out prison so that it would inhabit increasingly smaller areas of our social and psychic landscape. I'm kind of in love with Davis's notion of crowding out prisons as a social strategy and building up alternative institutions. So whenever Davis talks about abolition, she wants to make abundantly clear that abolition is certainly about eliminating certain unjust institutions. That's what abolition has always been about. That's what it was in relation to the plantation system. But it's also about building up alternative institutions that can resolve social problems and social conflict differently, right? That's critical. It's both destructive and productive or generative or creative. So for example, Davis often reminds us that the two largest mental health facilities in the United States of America are Rikers Island in New York and LA County Prison in California. The data that we have suggests that just over 40% of people in prison struggle with some form of mental health illness. And so Davis argues that we have chosen collectively to manage mental health problems, particularly among less affluent demographics, by warehousing these people in prisons. Her response to the situation should be familiar to us at this point. It is to press for different ways of allocating resources. Free and accessible healthcare for all should be normative in the United States of America. If we manage this problem differently, we would begin to block one path to incarceration. This is what she means by crowding out prisons. You build up alternative institutions to deal with problems and challenges before they become criminalized. And her basic thesis is we've criminalized poverty, we've criminalized mental health, illness, and we've criminalized drug addiction. So let's build up different institutions and policies to deal with these problems and root them out at their kind of source, right? Now let me turn over to Pope Francis. In a speech given to inmates in a prison in Mexico in 2016, Pope Francis utilized different language, but arrived at, I think, a similar conclusion. He offered the following observation that's up here. Prisons are an indication of the kind of society we are. In many cases, they are a sign of the silence and omissions which have led to a throwaway culture. Reintegration or rehabilitation begins by creating a system which we would call a system of social health that endeavors to promote a culture which acts and seeks to prevent those situations and pathways that end in damaging and impairing the social fabric. The problem of security is not resolved alone or only by incarcerating. Rather, it calls us to intervene by confronting the structural and cultural causes of insecurity that impact the entire social framework. Social reintegration begins by making sure that all of our children go to school and that their families obtain dignified work by creating public spaces for leisure and recreation, and by fostering civic participation, health services, and access to basic services, just to name a few possible measures. So let me just make a few remarks about the really interesting similarities I see between Angela Davis and Pope Francis here. First, if we think in terms of the just peace model, both Davis and Francis emphasize the centrality of preventative efforts. They both contend that the failure to meaningfully address structural injustice almost inevitably leads to the use of prisons to deal with some of the most significant social problems that we face. In this sense, both Davis and Francis are stridently anti-neoliberal. They think that public goods exist, welfare, healthcare, education, that these public goods should be funded by governments, and that these public goods should contribute to the health and well-being of all members of society. So a neoliberal vision of reality is that you can have access to these goods if you compete effectively on the market. Education, healthcare, food, these types of things, right? To give one concrete example, it costs $132,860 annually to incarcerate one person in the state of California. $133,000 to incarcerate one person in the state of California. It costs around $35,000 to $40,000 to attend state colleges and universities in California if you're a resident of California. So during the neoliberal era, we have increasingly rejected education as a public good and embraced incarceration, indeed mass incarceration, as a public good. And the funding has followed. Davis and Francis would argue, in effect, that this is not an approach to governance that leads to social health. Rather, it leads to its opposite. Second, Davis calls for a justice system based on reparation and reconciliation rather than retribution and punishment. This clearly converges with the third principle of just peace practice, and Pope Francis has reflected extensively on this in the context of criminal justice reform. The basic premise that Davis and Francis share here is that there is nobody who is, in secular terms, incorrigible, in theological terms, irredeemable. There is an inherent dignity in each individual, and our task should be to support processes that produce healing for victims, as well as perpetrators or aggressors. Davis and Francis are really trying to get us to think about what our end game is. Do we want to harm people because they have harmed others? Is that the goal? Punishment and retribution? Or do we want to attempt to restore the health of people who have been wounded by others and those who have wounded others, right? I mean, it's really trying to press upon what the criminal justice system is about. Is it about punishment, or is it about reconciliation and rehabilitation? The judgment that Davis makes and I would make is that in large measure at this point in history, the criminal justice system focuses on punishment and not enough on rehabilitation and restoration. Now, I don't want to suggest that Davis and Francis agree on everything. They differ on any number of issues. Not least among them, that Francis remains an advocate for abolition as a horizon, but appears to still see a fundamental, if diminished, role in society for policing, prisons, and the military. In effect, he adopts a radical reformist posture, even as he affirms that the abolition of war should be the aim or the goal. Recall that Francis continues to defend the right to self-defense, and his commitments on criminal justice seem to affirm a limited role for policing and prisons. Francis and Davis would disagree on this. There's a book that recently came out by Tommy Shelby, who's a philosopher and a professor of African American studies at Harvard, and I recommend it. It's a really nice book titled The Idea of Prison Abolition, in which he engages in a sympathetic and constructive dialogue with Davis's work. He takes it very seriously, but comes down as a radical reformist rather than a Davis-style abolitionist. And it's because he remains convinced that policing and prisons still function in some way to deter crime. And he uses the term incapacitate serious and grave threats to public order. And so we still need police and prisons, but we have to significantly diminish the role that they play in society. I think this is basically Francis's position, in which he would argue for abolition as the horizon and radical reformism as the concrete practice. I have a conclusion in which I kind of tried to do a preventative strike about the realism of this project, but I think I've spoken for long enough, and perhaps in the question and answer, I can unload some of those thoughts on you. So I'll end here. Thank you so much for your attention to this lecture.